Here's how to teach the basic writing strategies. These are the grammar questions on the SAT. Notice that we lay out both strategies, identifying sentence errors and improving sentences. And it's really key to make sure that students take hold of these strategies. Because, for example, on identifying sentence errors, what students will tend to do is get in the habit of reading the sentence over, reading it a couple more times, and just keep reading and reading and rereading it until they find something that sounds wrong. Either that, or they'll read it 10 times and go, well, okay, nothing's wrong, but then it took them 5 minutes. So you want to make sure, remind them that this is really about being efficient. We're going to help them look for the most common error types and some of the lesser common error types. And the more efficiently they can find those more common errors, the more time they're going to have for harder problems that feature less common errors or no error. So here is how to teach these strategies. For the identifying sentence errors, remember that here you don't have to fix the error, you just need to find it, right? You're going to have 4 underlined portions. Step number 1 is to read. Use your grammar ear. You guys all interact with English every day. You read it, you speak it, you hear it. Even if you don't think of yourself as a grammar person, you do have a pretty good internal compass when it comes to grammar. So use your grammar ear, read the sentence. Does anything just sound wrong? If so, you've probably found your error. I say probably because keep in mind that sometimes things that sound right in everyday speech are actually grammatically incorrect. And that's just because we as people tend to say things that are grammatically incorrect because they're shortcuts usually. So if you find something that you think is wrong, one of these underlined portions, make sure you can think of a better way to say it. If you can't think of a better way to say it, that might be because it's not actually wrong. So make sure you can think of a better way to say an underlined portion you think is incorrect. But let's say you read the sentence once and you don't find an error. Should you read the sentence 2 or 3, 4 or 5 more times and really just try to hear it? No, that's not going to be very efficient. Chances are if you don't hear it the first time you read it, you're not going to hear it the second time, right? If it were obvious, you would have heard it the first time. So the key is to make this as formulaic as possible. You want to apply a system of rules as soon as you don't hear an error to make sure you're not overlooking some of the more common error types. And that brings us to the next step. Check the big 2. By the big 2, we mean verbs and pronouns. These are 2 big parts of speech, and they're where the most common error types occur. So we're going to specifically outline what the verb and pronoun aspects to look for are in just a moment. But as part of the overall strategy, you want to check verbs and pronouns. And again, we'll go through those specific rules in a moment. If the verbs and the pronouns are being used correctly, then go on to step number 3, which is to eliminate. This should sound familiar from the critical reading and the sentence completion strategies. Look at the underlined portions and start eliminating one by one. Which one are you most certain is grammatically correct? Okay, cross that one off. Among the remaining 3, which one are you most certain is grammatically correct? Okay, cross that one off. Between the remaining 2, which one are you more certain is grammatically correct? Cross that one off. That last underlined portion, is it right or is it wrong? Right? You want to make sure you're eliminating. Don't worry about finding the right answer, which in this case means the grammatically incorrect portion. Focus on eliminating the answers that are incorrect, meaning those portions that are grammatically correct. Finally, step number 4, if you're able to eliminate all 4 portions when you start eliminating one by one, then relax. Don't force yourself to find an error. If you've gone through this strategy and you haven't found an error, it's probably a no error. The key, though, is that you don't want to read the sentence once and say, well, this sounds fine, and then just pick E. If you do that, you're probably going to miss a lot of errors that are a little bit more subtle. So make sure you're going through this strategy. Let's take a look at a sample problem below. And at this point, you can have everyone read the sentence, or you can have someone read it out loud, whatever you prefer. But let's say someone reads it out loud. If he or she does hear an error, great. But if he or she doesn't hear an error, direct them to the strategy. So for example, I would have so-and-so read it, and let's say so-and-so doesn't find an error. Okay, well, remember that the first thing you want to look for is underlined verbs. Now, we haven't talked yet about the verb rules, but let's look at the underlined verbs. We'll do a quick preview of the first verb rule. And so will respond, okay, offer is a verb. Good, so let's highlight the verb offer, or underline it, or draw an arrow to it in your book, whatever you want to do. The first thing you want to look for with verbs is to make sure that the subject and the verb agree in terms of number, meaning singular subject goes with a singular verb, plural subject goes with a plural verb. So, so-and-so, what is the subject of the verb offer? And at this point, the so-and-so might say, well, it's photographers or photographs. All right, well, it looks like photographs or photographers is the subject of the sentence. That's where the logical approach can sometimes break down. You can use logic to try to figure out the subject, what is actually offering a glimpse. But sometimes that might lead you astray. It does kind of sound like maybe the photographers or the photographs are offering a glimpse into Southeast Asia. But here's a second approach. And this is something that is foolproof, and especially if you feel like you're not good at identifying subjects, this will make your life a lot easier. The key is to focus on words like of. Who can tell me what part of speech the word of is? And hopefully at some point somebody will interject, it's a preposition. Good, of is a preposition. All those little words like of, to, near, by, at, all those kind of words that sort of tell you where you are, or you know, where something's happening, when something's happening, why something is happening. All those words are prepositions, right? Every time you have a preposition, you always have a noun that follows it pretty closely. For example, we have of 300 photographs. Well, the preposition plus that eventual noun create a prepositional phrase. And when you see a prepositional phrase, you can kind of lightly cross it out if you're trying to find the subject of a verb. The reason is that the subject of a verb will never be inside of a prepositional phrase, at least for our purposes on the SAT. It just can't be there. So if you cross off prepositional phrases, it'll make it a lot easier to identify what the actual subject is. We could do the same thing with the verb or the word by here. What part of speech is the word by, anyone? It's another preposition. What's the noun that eventually follows it? Well, 100 photographers, right? So here we go again. We can cross off this prepositional phrase. And now if we read the sentence aloud, we should be able to hear more easily what the subject is. The book, a compilation, offer a glimpse into daily life, blah, blah, blah. Well, at this point, hopefully that student so-and-so will say, oh yeah, the subject is actually book. Okay, good. Well, all we need to do is say the subject and the verb together. So-and-so, say the subject and the verb together. How do they sound together? Oh, the book offer. Huh, doesn't sound good. You're right. And what should it be? Good. It should be the book offers, right? And there is our error. Notice that this is a lot harder to hear when you have all that other junk in the way. Those prepositional phrases are put there on purpose to distract you from the subject. Remember that the test is trying to trick you at every turn. So if you get rid of the garbage, you'll see what's important, and it'll make it easier to identify that error. All right, so let's look at the improving sentences strategy. Here, you not only have to identify the error, you have to fix it, right? Identify that there is an error and then fix it. Or determine that the original is correct. So, with these, just like with sentence completions, we don't want to get sucked into plugging every answer choice in and reading the sentence 5 times over, especially because the answer choices here are usually fairly long. So plugging in 5 answer choices is going to start to get confusing. All the answers are going to start to sound alike. So first thing is cover. This should sound familiar from critical reading and sentence completions. Cover the answer choices with your hand, then read the sentence and listen using that internal grammar ear. If the underlined part is clearly right, what you probably want to do, instead of just marking answer choice A, is keep the, at this point, cover the sentence, and then make sure you can eliminate B through E. Now, this doesn't mean plugging B through E in. It means looking at those answers on their own merits and eliminating them as worse, right? You don't want to plug in just to check that the original is right. If you're confident the original is right, then the other 4 are going to have to be worse, and you should be able to hear those and be able to eliminate those. And once you've eliminated B through E on their own merits, then you can go with A. But only about 20% of these questions will have the original be correct. So most of these are going to have an error, and hopefully you will hear most of those errors. So the second thing here is more likely. You're going to be able to tell more often that the underlying part is clearly wrong, in which case you want to anticipate a correction. And then again, instead of worrying so much about finding the right answer, focus again on eliminating, right? Remember that we always want to keep our students eliminating. It's not about finding the right answer, it's about getting rid of 4 wrong answers. The reason that's so important is, A, it's really easy to see an answer that looks kind of good and say, okay, well this is pretty good, this must be it, and not look at 2 or 3 other answer choices because you're rushing. But maybe you forget to look at E, and E turns out to be the right answer. It's better than the one you picked. Also, if you're able to eliminate 4 wrong answers, that will give you confidence that you're getting the question right. And the more confidence you have, the less kind of hemming and hawing and thinking about previous questions you're going to do as you move forward. That'll keep you more efficient. All right, now occasionally you might not be able to tell whether the underlying portion is right or wrong, in which case, skip it and move to the next one. Remember that as part of our overall strategy, we always want students to be working on questions that they find easiest. Generally that means earlier math questions and earlier sentence completions, but in these sections there's only a very slight trend for the questions to get harder as you move through them. So it isn't like if you can't do number 2, you're going to find number 3 even harder. If you're not sure whether the underlying portion is right or wrong, just skip it and move on to one where you can tell whether the underlying portion is right or wrong. That's probably going to be easier for you to tackle. Which brings us to step 4 then, go back. If you did end up skipping a couple because you couldn't tell if the underlying portion was right or wrong, go back to those at the end when you've just got 2 or 3 minutes, however much time left, and you can start plugging in answer choices to try to find the right one. The reason we save this for last is that this is not a very efficient strategy. Again, if you're having to read the sentence 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 times, that's going to take time and it's not going to be very efficient. So save that till the end as a last resort. So let's look at an example. And first thing we're going to do is cover the answers. So if you have your students looking at their workbooks, make sure they slap their hands down over the answer choices, just like we did with sentence completions and critical reading. Cover those answers. Now we can anticipate from a clean slate. You can have people read this on their own. You can have someone read it out loud. But Caroline nodded off during the movie, which eventually had caused her to drop her bowl of popcorn. At this point, most students will say, well, the had sounds a little weird. We don't really need that. Okay, so let's cross off the had, right? Which eventually caused her to drop her bowl. Yeah, sounds like we don't really need the had. Okay. Now here again, what I like to do is cover the actual sentence because again, it's really tempting, or it's really easy to just kind of laze back into plugging every answer choice in, but that's not what we want to do. Some students will find this kind of harder to work with at first, the idea of covering the sentence. But what we want to focus on is really getting students to work on their anticipations, because if you know that you can just plug back in, that will probably weaken your impulse to come up with an anticipation. But if you're forced to anticipate and actually figure out what's wrong with the sentence and what needs to be fixed about it, that's going to strengthen your grammar skills, which is going to make you more efficient on the actual SAT. Take some practice, but it will pay off in the long run. All right, so we know what we're anticipating. We're getting rid of the word had. Remember that A is always the same as the original in these questions, so we can automatically cross off A. Let's just look at B. We don't need to plug it back in. Let's see if it fixes the original problem. Okay, well, technically this does fix the problem, right? I mean, and again, you should ask the students yes, no, maybe. A lot of students might say no. In fact, most or all of them might say no. What you can point out is that yes, technically this fixes the original problem. We got rid of the word had, but we didn't really want to change anything else. We didn't want to add anything in. And what you can see by B, even if we're not plugging it in, if you sound out movie and which eventually this caused her, it just doesn't sound good. It isn't flowing properly. So while it fixes the original problem, it creates a new problem. So let's get rid of B. How about answer choice C? Does this fix the problem? Yes, no, maybe? Okay, some students might say yes on this. Some might say no. In which case, if you get a lot of yeses or maybes, you can leave it. We can always come back to it. Remember, just focus on getting rid of things that we know are definitely wrong. How about D? Yes, no, maybe. And again here, a lot of students will probably say no. You might get one or two who aren't sure, but this is one where, again, we don't want to change the grammar of the sentence. We just want to get rid of, and we don't want to change the structure. We just want to get rid of that one verb had. The problem here is that after the semicolon, we would have to have what would otherwise be a complete sentence. We'd have to have a main verb, but causing is not a main verb. It's an ing, it's a participle, which means that D is not going to work. And finally, what about E? Yes, no, maybe? Good. Pretty much everybody is saying yes. This is what we anticipated. It gets rid of the word had. It doesn't change anything else, right? And if we were still left with C, we could point out, again, that we didn't want to change the underlying structure. We wanted the second part not to be a main verb clause, but instead to come after the word which, to be a dependent clause. We don't have to get too technical with grammar terms. But the problem with C is that after this comma, we now are starting to have a main verb phrase. Eventually this caused, so this is going to be a run-on sentence, which means E is our answer. It's exactly what we anticipated. Notice that we don't need to plug back in to recognize that E gives us what we need. We can save ourselves a lot of time by just eliminating intelligently. So now let's look at the big two, the verbs and the pronouns. Again, when you're teaching the verbs and the pronouns, it's really important to remind your students that they want to get to these rules as quickly as possible. If they don't hear an error, that's fine. There's no shame in not hearing an error. What you want to do is get to the rules effectively and efficiently so that you're not reading the sentence 5 times and resisting the formula here. The formula is here because it works. Point out that the most common error type is this first one, subject-verb agreement. And verb and pronoun errors in general cover about 50% of the errors in the identifying sentence errors section, and a portion of the improving sentences errors as well. So we put these rules first because they show up a lot, and the more efficiently you can use these rules, the more efficiently you can work through the whole section. So, for example, the big two verbs. Well, we've already looked at this first rule, but now we're just going to recap it and see different ways in which the SAT tests it. Subject-verb agreement. This again is about whether the subject and the verb match in terms of singular and plural. Here's a simplistic example. A, this tests are really boring. Anybody think that sounds good? No, you guys can all hear that that sounds wrong. What about B? This test is really boring. Yeah, you guys can all hear that this sounds correct. Because test is a singular noun, is a singular verb, test is, right? So the secret with this rule is to just identify the subject and say it with a verb. Do they make sense, right? If you see an underlined verb in these identifying sentence errors, make sure you identify the subject. Remember what we talked about, use prepositional phrases to cross off prepositional phrases to make it easier to identify the subject. Do the subject and the verb sound good together? Your ear will never let you down on this one. You guys know English too well to ever miss it as long as you properly identify the subject. Similarly, if you're doing improving sentences and you see that a verb is underlined, make sure you identify the subject and see if they match. Right? So let's take a look at number 1. And again, presumably here you'll still be doing these aloud, so you can have student so-and-so read number 1 aloud. Alright, so student so-and-so, you read the question, do you hear an error in number 1? And let's say the student says D and straddling. Well, then press the student. Okay, how else would you say D? Well, maybe just and straddle. Okay, well, let's plug that in and see how it sounds. Go ahead and read it that way. And just read the, you can just read the last portion of the sentence. And straddle the Vermont border are the Green Mountains. Oh, okay, no, I guess that doesn't sound so good. All right, so you found something, you tried to come up with a better way to say it, it didn't work, so maybe it's not wrong. Let's go straight to the rules if you haven't identified a concrete error that you know you can fix. First thing we look for is underlined verbs. Do we have any underlined verbs? And eventually someone you ask will come around to, yeah, B, runs is an underlined verb. Great. What's the subject of the verb runs? And so might likely say border, because Often the subject of a verb comes right before the verb. All right, so it might look like the border is the subject of the verb runs, but two ways we can approach this. One, logically, is the border doing the running along Berkshire County's western border? What is it that's actually running along Berkshire County's western border? Is the border running along the border? That doesn't seem to make sense. But even if students are having trouble with the logic approach, remember the second foolproof approach, prepositional phrases. So, what part of speech is the word along? Can anybody tell me? Good. This is another preposition, right? Up the tree, at the store, near the fence, by the river, along Berkshire County's western border. Here's another prep phrase, right? Western border. Border is the eventual noun that ends the prepositional phrase. What do we do with prepositional phrases? Good. We cross them out, at least for the purpose of finding the subject of a verb. Now, what are we left with? What has to be the subject of the verb? What's doing the running? Good. It is, in fact, the mountains, the Taconic Mountains, but we just need the word mountains. All we need to do now is say the subject and the verb together. How do they sound, so-and-so? Right, you can't say the mountains runs. What should it be? Yeah, it should be the mountains run. Notice how easy it is to hear that error when you take away the excess verbiage. If you just focus on the subject and the verb, say them together in the order subject and verb, you'll never make a mistake. Your ear knows what's correct. But keep in mind that this is one of the ways the SAT will try to trick you. We've already talked about the fact that they'll use prepositional phrases to try to separate the subject and the verb. But here what they're doing is putting the subject after the verb, which is not normal English word order. Normally you say, I went to the store, not went I to the store. Even though the subject comes after the verb, the same subject-verb agreement rules apply. Say the subject, then the verb, and see how they sound. If they don't sound good, it's because they're not right. Your ear will let you know. So B is our answer. Let's take a look at another example here. Number 3, we'll do an improving sentences question. First thing, remember to remind your students to cover the answers, and you can have someone read it out. Okay, so how did the underlined portion sound? Right or wrong? Okay, and if they say that they aren't sure or that it sounds okay, point out that the first thing they want to look for is underlined verbs. Do we have any underlined verbs? Good, the word was, right? What's the subject the verb was? What is it that was a secret? And again, someone might say the recipe. Okay, well, it sounds like the recipe is the subject, but remember our trusty friend, the prepositional phrase. Of is a preposition, right? Probably the most common one that you'll see on the SAT. What's the noun that follows it? Recipe. What can you do with prepositional phrases? Exactly, cross them off. What about the word for? What part of speech is that? Also a preposition. What's the noun that follows it? Dessert. What do we do with prepositional phrases? Cross them off. Now, so-and-so, read the sentence again and tell me whether you think the underlined portion sounds okay. All right, you can't say the details was. What do you have to say instead? Good, it's got to be the details were, right? All right, good. So now let's cover over the sentence. We don't want to be suckered into plugging back in. Cover over the sentence. We know exactly what our fix is. We don't need to plug back in. We just need to focus on eliminating answer choices that don't fix the problem. Now, in something like this where the fix is happening right at the beginning of the underlined portion, it's the first word, what we can also do is avoid looking at the full answer choice because there's only one word we really need to concern ourselves with, that first word. So instead of reading through full answer choices, we're just going to focus on that word. So if you have the dexterity, you can try to cover, or some sort of covering device, you can try to cover full answer choices and just focus on one word at a time. So for example, let's scoot this into place, but let's look at answer choice A we know is the same as the original. That's not going to fix the problem, so let's cross that off automatically. And answer choice B, just look at the first word. Does it fix the problem? Yeah, it does. So let's go ahead and leave B. We don't even need to read the rest of it because a couple more answers probably won't work. Let's look at the first word of C. Is. Well, that changes the tense, but does it fix the subject-verb problem? Nope, because is singular, right? And of course, you want to ask your students that. Does that fix the problem? They'll say no. Okay, good. Cross off C. Notice we don't need to read the rest of C. It doesn't matter what the rest says because the first word doesn't work. What about the first word of D? Does that fix the problem? Okay, the first word works, so we'll leave it. What about the first word of E? Does that fix the problem? Nope. Notice again, we don't need to read the full answer choice. Why waste time doing that? E definitely doesn't work. So we're down to B and D. Okay, well, now we can look at these answer choices more fully. And let's look through them. B, were a secret passed down through generations. How does that sound? Good, bad, maybe? Okay, presumably you'll get a lot of goods and maybes. All right, let's check D. Were a secret having been passed down through generations. Good, bad, maybe? And you'll probably get some more bads and maybe a couple maybes. If you get somebody saying maybe, then push them. Which one of the two is worse? Remember that we always want to keep eliminating. So between B and D, does one seem worse to you? And more often than not, pretty much almost exclusively, they'll be able to eliminate D. Just because it seems wordier. We don't need the ing having been passed down, right? We don't need the having. It makes the answer longer because it's wordier. So that leaves us with B. Notice again that we don't need to plug in answer choices. We just need to eliminate intelligently. There were only two that fixed the original problem. Then it's just one more step to get to the answer. All right, so let's look at a couple more examples on this page. Number 2, we'll go through this a little more quickly, but number 2, again, you can have someone read it out, and if he or she doesn't hear an error, start with the verbs. Okay, do we have any underlined verbs? All right, we have arranged. True, that's a verb. One thing, though, is that past tense verbs, you don't need to worry about subject-verb agreement because they're always the same in the singular and the plural. For example, I arranged, we arranged. The only exception is the verb to be. I was, we were. Oh, okay, we also have were underlined. All right, so good idea to highlight that or circle it. What's the subject here? Now, this one is tricky, and this doesn't get tested quite so directly on the SAT, but technically the pronoun combination neither nor is a singular combination, and that is the subject of the verb. And these pronouns go, or this combination goes with a singular verb, right? So again, this is a harder one. It's more subtle. It doesn't really get tested this way on the SAT, but it should be neither was available, right? So B would be our answer. But let's move on to number 4. This one is something that's tested more directly. Remember to have your students cover the answers, and you can have someone read it out. Okay, if you don't hear an error, what's the first thing we look for? Good, underlined verbs. Do we have an underlined verb? Yes, we do. We have the underlined verb, have grown. And really the part we care about is the have. That's the conjugated part that changes form. What's the subject? What is it that have grown to nearly 37 million? Well, you think it's acres? Okay. What about the word of? What part of speech is that? Again, it's a preposition. What's the noun that follows it? The word acres. What do we do with prepositional phrases? Cross them off, right? So acres can't be the subject. Similarly, the word by. What part of speech? Good. Another preposition. What's the noun that follows it? Well, we have certified ranch management. Those are basically adjectives describing the word companies. So here's the whole prepositional phrase. What do we do with prepositional phrases? Good, we cross them off. Read the sentence one more time and let's see how it sounds. Okay, so what's the subject of the verb have? Good, it's actually the word number. Now all you have to do is say the subject and the verb together. And how do they sound? Good. You can't say the number have. What do you have to say? The number has. The number has grown. Good. So notice again, it's sometimes tricky to hear the error because of the prepositional phrases, but if you cross them off, It becomes a lot easier to identify the subject and hear that the verb is wrong. Well, just like we did on number 3, we don't need to necessarily read through the full extent of every answer choice because a lot of the answers are not going to fix the problem. Starting with A, that's the same as the original. We know that's not going to work. We just need to find a singular verb up front. So how about B? Have. First word, it's already, what do you guys think? Yes, no, maybe? Yeah, it's already wrong, right? We don't want have. We need to be has if we're going to use that verb. Let's get rid of that. What about the first word of C? Okay, does that fix it? Yeah, has fixes it, so let's leave it. What about D? Okay, does that fix it? Good, it does, so we'll leave it. And finally, what about E? Was, does that fix it? Yeah, technically it's a singular verb. The plural would be were. Was is a singular verb. Okay, so now let's just look at the answers again, C, D, and E. And we'll go through these one by one. How about C? Yes, no, maybe? Okay, a lot of you like it. What about D? Nobody likes this one. Yeah, has to be grown. Why introduce this passive infinitive, to be grown? It makes the answer longer. It's certainly longer than C, and it's wordier, and it sounds more awkward. So we probably don't want that. What about E? Was growing from? Yes, no, maybe? It just seems wordier than C again, right? It's not terrible, but it's not as good as C. So let's get rid of it, and we're left with C, right? Keep in mind that shorter answers are usually correct here. Not all the time, but when in doubt, go with a shorter answer. All right, so now let's talk about the second aspect of verbs, and this is verb tense. So you want to remind your students that this is all about formula, right? The first thing to look for with underlined verbs is subject-verb agreement. That's probably the most common error. But if they get through subject-verb agreement and don't find an error, they want to stick with verbs and examine the tense, right? Keep them on verbs, make sure they kind of exhaust the different possibilities for verbs while they're focused on them. So here's another simplistic example of the error. I looked for my cheat sheet, but I couldn't find it. How does that sound to your ear? Yeah, it doesn't sound very good, right? Whereas B, I looked for my cheat sheet, but I couldn't find it. That does sound good, right? So when you have gone through the subject-verb agreement issues and you haven't found any errors, then you want to look at those same underlined verbs to examine their tenses. Are the verbs in the right tense? In identifying sentence errors, ask yourself if the tenses match the timeline for the actions happening in the sentence. Do the actions need to be in the same tense? Are they happening at the same time as they are in the example of looking for the cheat sheet but not finding it? Those are both happening in the past. Or are the actions happening in different times, in which case they need to be in different tenses? Similarly, in improving sentences, if you see an underlined verb and the subject-verb agreement thing is fine, check the tense. Does it match the tense of another verb in the sentence? Does it need to match the verb of another tense? Or does it need to be different? So number 5, let's take a look at this example. Okay, and so, when you read it out loud, did you hear an error? Okay, now, as a quick note, if you need to, in the interest of time, you can use these questions to just focus on the specific error types. Obviously, if somebody read number 5 and they didn't hear an error, out of context, you'd want them to start with subject-verb agreement, right? To help them solidify that, and because that's the most common error, you want to start there with your strategy. But since often, depending on the level of grammar of your students, it can take a while to get through some of these concepts. If you feel like you're moving slowly, you can just start with these specific concepts. So, so you read this question, you didn't hear an error. Let's talk about do we have any underlined verbs? Okay, yeah, the verb remains, right? Let's highlight that. Now, in the interest of time, let's say that we've gone through rule number 1, the subject-verb agreement error. There's no problem there. What tenses remains? Good, it's present tense, right? What tense are the other verbs in the sentence? Okay, good, yeah, we have a lot of past tense, right? We may have discovered, we have saw, we have did not know, that's past tense. What he had discovered, again past tense. We have all these past tense verbs. All of a sudden we switch to the present. Does that make sense? No, because all those actions are happening at the same time, right? And of course Newton is dead, the sentence tells us that, so gravity can't still today be a mystery to him, right? So how would we fix this? Yeah, it should be gravity remained, right? Notice now that it matches the past tense we see in the other sentences, in the other verbs. Okay, good. Let's move on to number 6. So-and-so, go ahead and read it out loud. All right, if you don't hear an error, let's go straight to the verbs. Do we have any underlined verbs? Okay, responded to. Again, in the interest of time, let's say that we've already explored the subject-verb agreement situation. And note, again, though, that when you have a past tense verb, you don't need to worry about subject-verb agreement, except for the verb to be. So what tense is responded? Yeah, it's past tense. Do we have other verbs in the sentence, whether they're underlined or not? And if so, what tense are those other verbs? Right, we have are testing. Well, the verb are is definitely present tense, right? Do those tenses need to match? Yeah, they do, because it doesn't make sense logically for them to be testing them right now to see how they already responded, right? They can't have already responded if they're just testing them now. So there is a disconnect there, and the answer here should be D. How else should we say it? Yeah, we could just cross that off and say how the students respond, or maybe even how the students will respond, right? It doesn't matter, we don't have to fix these, of course, but it can't be past tense. So see how the students respond. And I should have pointed out that number 5, that was D as well, just to make it clear. All right, so now let's look at the improving sentences. Starting with number 7, have your students cover the answers once again. You can have someone read it out loud. All right, if you don't like the original, how would you fix it? What would you anticipate? Okay, good. And most students here would anticipate something like would ensure fairness, right? It doesn't sound right to use the future tense will. So we're talking about something in the past. All right, well now, again, let's cover over the sentence. We don't want to get tempted into plugging back in. We don't need this sentence anymore, really. We just need to focus on answers that don't work. So we're looking at would as our anticipation. Remember that the A answer is always the same as the original, so let's get rid of that. What about B? Does B fix the problem? Okay, it's got the word would, yes, no, maybe. So we can leave it. A lot of you are saying yes or maybe. Some of you are saying no, that's fine. What about C? Okay, you guys are all saying no. Yeah, we need some sort of would in there, right? Would just sounds right, even if we're not sure why. So C's not going to work. What about D? Okay, yes, no, maybe. You guys all have D. You guys all like the would. Fine, let's leave that. What about E? Yes, no, or maybe. Okay, you guys are all saying no. Yeah, we don't want the present tense. We're talking about something in the past, so it's got to be in some form of the past tense. Well, we're left with B and D. Let's keep eliminating. Which one seems worse? So-and-so. Good. Yeah, B is worse. Notice again, it's wordier. It's longer than D. We also don't need the have. I mean, this is making it a slightly different tense, but you don't have to get too much into the sequence of the tenses to hear that B sounds worse. So D is our answer. All right. Number 8, same thing. Let's cover over the sentences, cover over the answer choices rather, and see what we can anticipate. All right, so-and-so, you're saying you don't like it. What would you anticipate instead? Or what don't you like about it if you're having trouble anticipating? Yeah, so there is something weird. It kind of makes it sound like the incident, the occurring is kind of describing the right thing, the wrong thing rather. We're trying to say that adult men and women still experience some of the effects of a traumatic incident that occurred, when those men and women were adolescents, right? It kind of makes it sound like now that the incident was an adolescent, which is obviously not what we mean. So how could we fix that? Yeah, we could say something like, when they were adolescents, right? Then we're clearly talking about the men and women being adolescents. There's no confusion there. Now, that may not be the exact fix that the answer choice is going for, but it certainly does fix the problem. It should make it easier for us now to eliminate answers that don't fix the problem. So let's cover over the sentence once again, and now we'll just go through the answer choices, eliminate ones that don't fix the problem. Remember that A is the same as the original, so we'll get rid of that. How about B? Does B fix the problem? Yes, no, maybe? No, it doesn't fix it because it still doesn't specify. It sounds like the incident was adolescence, right? Well, that's not what we need. What about C? Does C fix the problem? Well, same exact problem, right? And the error here, this is a little typo, that should be an adolescent, but that's not the error, of course. They don't test that. The problem is it still doesn't specify who were adolescents. What about D? Yes, no, maybe? Okay, that definitely fixes the problem. It goes with what we anticipated. So finally, what about E? Yes, no, maybe? Okay, technically it might fix the problem. It specifies, I mean, each, although technically each could still refer to the word incident, but what you can probably hear is that, and a lot of you are saying no, that this sounds worse, right? That has occurred as each was an adolescent. It just sounds wordier. It's not necessarily longer than D, but it does sound wordier. So let's get rid of it and go with D. Happens to be what we anticipated. All right, so once you get through the two verb rules, you want to re-emphasize the fact that these two verb rules will help them find about 25% of the errors in the identifying sentence errors section. And they'll help them find a couple errors in the improving sentences as well. So verbs are where to start. If they get through verbs, then on to pronouns. Here we go. All right, let's say you go through the verbs and you don't find an error. Well, then you want to go straight to underlined pronouns, the next most common site of errors. Let's take a look at a simplistic error type. This is pronoun, number, and gender. So take a look at A, again, simplistic example. Grammar is hard, I hate it. Okay, that sounds good. What about B? Grammar is hard, I hate them. Well, your ear can tell that that doesn't sound right? When you see an underlined pronoun, it's a good idea to circle it and draw an arrow to the word it is representing or taking the place of or referring to. And then ask yourself, is that word singular or plural? Well, grammar is singular. And is that pronoun singular or plural? Well, them is plural. Is it logical to use a plural pronoun to refer to a singular subject? No, there is no way to do that, and there are no exceptions to that. Despite what people think, there are no situations in which you can use a plural pronoun to refer to a singular subject. Now, as a quick note, the suggestion here is to circle the word that the pronoun is replacing. You can kind of have students do whatever they like. I tend to prefer circling the underlined pronoun just because I think that helps students get in the habit of looking for underlined pronouns and getting on top of them as quickly as possible. But obviously the key thing is looking for the match. Do the pronoun and its referent match. Okay, so for identifying sentence errors, make sure you determine whether an underlined pronoun matches with the thing it's replacing. Same thing with improving sentences. If you see a pronoun as part of the underline, make sure you know what it's referring to and make sure that it matches. Let's take a look at number 9. All right, so-and-so, you've read it out loud, you didn't hear an error, fine. Normally we would look for verbs first, but in the interest of time, let's say we've checked out the verb rules and we didn't find a problem. Let's go to the pronouns. Do we see any underlined pronouns? Okay, good. Them is an underlined pronoun. Good idea to circle the word them. And what specific word in the sentence is the word them referring to? And sometimes a student will say children, at which point I'll point out, well, I don't see the word children in the sentence. It's got to be referring to a specific word in the sentence. So what one particular word is them replacing? Right, it's trying to take the place of the word a child, right? But is child singular or plural? A child is singular, good. What about them? Is that singular or plural? How many things does them refer to? One or many? It's always referring to many. Them is always plural. So can you have a plural pronoun referring to a singular noun? Nope. Here's our error. Now, the reason you might not hear this from the get-go is that this is a common error in everyday speech. The reason it's so common is that using the plural pronoun is a lot easier than using the correct singular pronoun. Since we don't know the gender of the child, anybody have an idea of how we would say this? Yeah, we'd have to say something like, get him or her tested, right? That just sounds more time-consuming and wordy to people, so instead they take the shortcut, them. The problem is them is always plural, right? It's never correct to use them as a singular pronoun. It just is not a singular pronoun. So keep in mind that your ear can sometimes deceive you, but if you look for underlined pronouns and make sure you know what they're referring to, you will never miss this kind of error. Okay? Let's take a look at number 11 here, and we'll cover over the answer choices once again. Make sure your students cover the answer choices. So-and-so read it out. Okay, if you don't hear an error, let's say we've looked for the verbs. Do we have any underlined pronouns if the verbs are okay? Okay, yeah, we have the verb they, good, or the pronoun they rather. Good idea to circle that. What specific word is they referring to? Okay, well, it could be, it sounds like it's referring to the word operas or soundtracks, but this is almost like a prepositional phrase. In fact, we do have a prepositional phrase, and we talk about prepositional phrases for verbs, but this whole this whole kind of phrase off in commas is really just describing music, right? So it's kind of its own self-enclosed phrase. It's almost, you could take that out and it wouldn't change the meaning of the sentence, which means that it's kind of self-contained. The they has to be referring to something in the main part of the sentence, not in one of those self-contained clauses. So what is they referring to? Good. It's trying to refer to the word music, but the word music is singular or plural. Good. It's singular. And the word they is singular or plural. Again, they is always plural. So what is the fix we need here? How do we change it? Yeah, it's got to be singular, which means it's got to be it, right? And of course, that means we have to change the verb, right? It creates distinctive and fresh impressions. All right. Well, we know very specifically what the fix is, and the it is coming pretty close to the beginning of the, the beginning of the answer. So, we can keep in mind, we can write in that we're adding that S on creates if we want. It creates. But we probably don't need to read through the full portion of every answer choice. We can just look at the first word or two in them. And we'll just go through yes, no, maybe. Obviously, A is the same as the original, so we'll cross that off. What about B, then? Look at the first word or two of B. Does that fix the problem? And I'll give you a little more. Okay. Maybe get some maybes, maybe some no's. I'll leave it since we have some maybes. Technically, this fixes the problem. It changes the they to an it. It's, okay, that's singular. So let's leave that. We can always come back to. What about C? Look at the first word or two. Can't work, right? Yes, no, maybe? Because the they is still there. We don't have to read the rest of it to know that C will not work. What about the first word or two of D? I'll give you a little bit more. Okay, technically, we're getting some maybes. Technically, this fixes the problem. There's no they anymore. We could leave it. What about E, then? Okay, E fixes the problem. All right, so now let's take a look at B, D, and E. Focus on eliminating ones that are worse. What about B? Yes, no, or maybe? It's not terrible, but it is wordy. You're correct. Again, ing verbs, they're not always wrong. In fact, sometimes you need them for parallelism, but they often make an answer choice wordy, right? It also just sounds a little awkward by its having created. It doesn't sound like it has a great flow, so let's get rid of that. How about D? Because of creating distinctive and fresh impressions. Okay, it's not terrible. E, because it creates distinctive and fresh impressions. A lot of people like E. E is what we anticipated. Between D and E, which one sounds worse? Yeah, D sounds worse, so we could eliminate that, right? It doesn't really specify D doesn't specify who or what is creating the distinctive and fresh impression, so it's less clear. All right. Now, you can take the students through the other examples. You can have them do them on their own. You can have them read them out loud. Whichever way you do it, keep having them focus on strategy. And again, with identifying sentence errors, that means make sure they're not reading over the sentence 5 times to hear an error. Read it once, maybe a second time. If you don't hear an error, get to those rules really quickly, verbs and then pronouns. With improving sentences, keep those answers covered. Make sure you're anticipating, right? It can be easy to, laze out of it and just say, well, I'm just going to find an answer that looks right. but that's again where careless errors occur. So make sure students are practicing the strategy. The more they practice with it, the more they're going to strengthen their muscles, the easier it's going to become for them. So let's flip the page and look at the other aspect of pronouns, and here we go. So if you've looked at the pronouns and they're okay in terms of number and gender, the other big aspect of pronouns you want to look at is pronoun case. For example, which one is right, he and I or him and me? And here, if you take a poll of your students by hand, a lot of students will say he and I, some will say him and me. And of course, this is a trick question. Well, you're both right because the answer is it depends. He and I is right in certain contexts. Him and me is right in certain other contexts. Take a look at these sample questions here. These sample sentences. Jill and I tore up the SAT. Well, hopefully that sounds good. What about B? Jill and me tore up the SAT. Okay, that sounds good to some of you, and that's because in everyday speech, colloquially, people will say this and they won't think twice about it. The problem is that A and B can't both be right. It can't be I tore up the SAT and me tore up the SAT. Only one of those is right. And that starts to hint at the strategy we're going to use. For some reason, it's really difficult to necessarily tell whether a pronoun is being used correctly when it's linked to another word, especially a noun or a pronoun. But anytime you do a pronoun by itself, you're always going to be able to tell whether it's in the right case, subject or object. How do we do that? Well, block off the other word that the pronoun is linked to and just focus on the pronoun. So for example, in A, I tore up the SAT. That sounds good. Which means that when we get rid of this block and we bring back Jill, then it's still got to be correct. Jill and I tore up the SAT. Right? I tore up the SAT, Jill and I tore up the SAT. If it works as I by itself, it's going to work with Jill together. What about B then? Let's apply the same concept. We'll box off that. Me tore up the SAT. Anybody think that sounds right? No, only a caveman would say that, right? Clearly, you would never say me tore up the SAT. You can all tell it's wrong. Your grammar tells you that. So it has to be I, right? And since me tore up the SAT is never right, correspondingly, Jill and me tore up the SAT is never right. It's only right when you change it to I, right? So, for identifying sentence errors, read the sentence using one pronoun at a time. This is really crucial. This is another one of these foolproof things, like crossing off prepositional phrases to help you find the subject of a verb. Doing each pronoun one at a time may seem like it'll slow people down, but it's a foolproof way to make sure the pronouns are being used correctly. Same thing in improving sentences. If you see an underlined pronoun and you've already checked the number and the gender, then if it's a situation where you can check the case, he versus him, she versus her, check that case, right? So let's take a look at some practice questions. Number 13. All right, so-and-so, you read it out loud. Did you hear an error? Okay, if you didn't hear an error, let's pretend that we've gone through the first three rules, the two verb rules and the first pronoun rule about pronoun reference. Then, do we have any underlined pronouns? Okay, good. We have he and me. Good idea to circle those pronouns, right? Now, let's say again that we've gone through the first pronoun rule about pronoun reference. Remember that the pronoun rule we want to test here is trying each pronoun on its own to see if it's in the right case. So, for instance, I'm going to block off the he and just read the relevant kind of portion of the sentence. How does it sound to you, the relevant phrase? You don't have to read the whole sentence. Sounds good? Yeah, the best course of action for me was to admit blah, blah, blah. You would never say the best course of action for I, right? It just doesn't sound right. Okay, so me is all right. What about the other part? What if we block off the and me? Now go ahead and read the relevant portion again. How does he sound? Not so good, right? The best course of action for he was to admit? No, that doesn't sound good. What does it have to be instead? We always want to make sure we can fix it. Good. It should be the best course of action for him, right? Remember that however the pronouns work on their own is how they have to work together. The best course of action for him, the best course of action for me, hence the best course of action for him and me. So B is our answer. And we can circle that. All right, and let's do an improving sentences question. Cover the answers once again. Read the original and anticipate. If you like the original, say good. If you don't like it, tell me how you would fix it. Okay, so a lot of you are pointing out a problem with her. For those of you who are unsure, let me start with you, so-and-so. Remember that when you see a pronoun underlined, if it's linked to another word by an and, you want to block off that other word and just try the pronoun on its own. How does that sound to you, the relevant phrase? Doesn't sound good, right? You wouldn't say her had hosted it. What should you say instead? What's our fix? Exactly. It's got to be she when she had hosted it. Okay, well, now we know exactly what the fix has got to be, and we can cover over the sentence and just focus on eliminating answers that don't fix the problem, right? So we're looking for that she. All right, we know A is the same as the original. Let's get rid of that. How about B? Yes, no, maybe? Okay, we're getting a lot of no's. We're getting some maybes. I'll leave B for a moment. We can always come back to it. What about C? Yes, no, maybe? Okay, a lot of yeses. We'll leave that. What about D? Looking at that second word, nope, you guys are right. It can't be her. It's got to be she had hosted it, or she had been the host. Still the subject, so D doesn't work. And finally, what about E? Well, it does change it to she. A lot of you guys are saying no, though. Why? Yeah, because she is no longer the subject. This is now the object of the preposition by, right? And if you're ever having trouble hearing which case to use, just take the phrase out of context. The book was written by she, or the book was written by her. Well, your ear will tell you that the book was written by her is correct, right? It was hosted by she, doesn't work, right? Notice also we have that wordy ing verb, it having been hosted by. It just doesn't sound good. So between B and C, which one is worse? Good. Yeah, B is worse. It's wordier. Grammatically speaking, it's not actually incorrect. The her is okay because, in contrast to E, or similar to E rather, we have the her as the object of the preposition by. It can't be she, it's got to be her. But B is really wordy because it's in the passive voice. It had been hosted by John and her. Grammatically, it might be okay, but stylistically, it's not preferable. It's certainly worse than C. So that is what we go with. All right, so that's how to teach the basics of the grammar stuff. There are obviously more practice problems and there are less common rules that you will take your students through. But the key thing, again, is to get students focused on strategies. Reading the sentence once, maybe a second time, but really focusing on one read, and if there's no hit in terms of an error, go straight to verbs. Go then straight to pronouns. Go then straight to eliminating. All right? Instead of somebody kind of getting lost in a sentence, reading it for 2 or 3 minutes and scratching their head and revisiting this portion and that portion, you basically want to compel your students to think about the fact that in any underlined portion, there's probably only 2 or 3 words, and with any given word, there's only so many things that could be wrong with it. Verbs and pronouns have more possibilities. That's why we start with them. But there still is a finite number. There's 3 or 4 different things you can check with a verb. With pronouns, there's 2 or 3 different things you can check. Make sure your students are using strategies to stay efficient.